The Colbert studio was already tense before the cameras turned on. Not chaotic, not loud, just tense in the way that happens when everyone senses something is about to go wrong, but no one can say exactly when. Denzel Washington had agreed to appear for what was billed as a panel on civic responsibility and patriotism in modern America. It was supposed to be a calm, thoughtful segment. But behind the scenes, there had been friction. Denzel's team had laid out boundaries. No cheap shots about his past roles, no forced political litmus tests, and no ambush-style commentary. The producers had agreed, or at least they said they had. But just minutes before airtime, a last-minute substitution was made. Stephen Miller would be joining the panel. The audience didn't know that yet. Denzel found out backstage, watching the monitor as Colbert casually introduced Miller as a senior policy voice from the last administration. That was when the room began to shift. Energy tightened. Denzel stood up from the green room couch. He didn't speak. He just stared at the screen for a long moment before adjusting his jacket and heading toward the stage. Colbert welcomed Denzel to thunderous applause. He smiled politely, gave a small wave, and took his seat. Then Stephen Miller entered. The applause was thinner, more confused than hostile. But Denzel didn't clap. He didn't look over. Not yet. Colbert jumped right in. He said, "Tonight we're talking about what patriotism means in divided times. We've got Denzel Washington, actor, activist, and someone who's spent years working with veterans and inner-city youth. And Stephen Miller, who, let's just say, has a different view of America's past and future." The audience laughed nervously. Denzel looked calm, at least outwardly. Colbert turned to Stephen first. He said, "Stephen, you've argued in the past that American identity is being diluted. That immigration, multiculturalism, even protest movements are eroding the country's strength. Can you explain what you mean by that?" Stephen smiled in that way he does, smug, careful, polished. He said, "Well, it's very simple. For a country to remain strong, it has to maintain a coherent culture, a shared set of values. What we've seen in recent decades is a fracturing of that identity. And yes, it's been encouraged by Hollywood elites who glorify rebellion and victimhood instead of unity and responsibility." The jab landed like a brick. Denzel turned his head slowly. He said, "You mean people like me?" Stephen held the smile. "If the shoe fits." There was a long pause. Colbert tried to jump in, but Denzel raised his hand slightly. Not to interrupt, just to hold the space. He said, "Stephen, I served." "Did you?" Stephen blinked. "Excuse me. I served," Denzel repeated. "In the U.S. Army, before I ever played a soldier on screen. I spent time in real barracks. Met real men who'd bled for this country. I've sat with mothers who buried sons in flag-draped coffins. I've mentored kids whose fathers came home broken or didn't come home at all. So when you talk about patriotism like it's something you trademarked, I take that personally." Stephen shifted in his seat. Denzel continued, "You sat behind a desk. You drafted speeches for a man who dodged service. You fed division for political gain. And now you want to lecture me about what it means to love this country." The room was dead silent. Stephen tried to recover. "With all due respect, acting isn't serving. You didn't wear the uniform in combat." Denzel's voice didn't rise, but it cut like a blade. "No, I wore it when the cameras weren't rolling. And I didn't need combat to understand sacrifice. I saw it in the faces of people who had nothing and still showed up every day to make their country better. You wouldn't know that, because sacrifice isn't something you've had to live. It's something you use as a prop." The audience didn't cheer. Not yet. They just sat in stunned stillness, processing what had just happened. Now, before you see what Denzel says next, and why this exchange would be edited in the official broadcast, I need to tell you something important. Moments like this aren't supposed to make it past the cutting room floor. The truth makes powerful people nervous. But if you're tired of the scripted version of public life, if you want the real, unsanitized truth, then hit that subscribe button right now. Subscribe before this clip gets buried. We're the only ones showing you what happens when the script breaks and real convictions take the stage. Now watch what Denzel does next, because the gloves are about to come off. Steven said, "You're twisting my words. I'm talking about values, about unity. You're making it about me." Denzel didn't flinch. He said, "You don't get to hide behind unity when everything you built was about division. You don't get to say values when you propped up policies that locked kids in cages, that demonized the press, that told millions of Americans they didn't belong in their own country." Steven's voice sharpened. "That's not fair." "No," Denzel said. "What's not fair is weaponizing fear for votes. What's not fair is painting immigrants as threats, protesters as enemies, and people who look like me as somehow less American." Steven leaned forward, voice rising. "You think you speak for America?" Denzel leaned in too. "No, but I listen to it, and I fight for it. Not with slogans, not with spin, but with actions, with accountability. You sold out that responsibility the moment you decided fear was more profitable than truth." The audience began clapping. Not wild applause, but something deeper. Recognition. Colbert looked stunned. For once, he wasn't sure how to pivot. Because the conversation had stopped being entertainment. It had become something else entirely. And what happens next would change the entire segment. Stephen Miller was trying to smile, but his face had gone stiff. His rehearsed calm had cracked, and there was no recovering it with charm. Not this time. Colbert shifted in his chair. For once, he looked like a guest on his own show, caught between wanting to move things along and knowing that what was unfolding was something the audience wasn't going to forget. Not now. Not ever. Stephen straightened his tie and tried to laugh it off. He said, "I'm not going to sit here and be insulted by someone who plays pretend for a living." Denzel didn't blink. He said, "You already sat. You're still sitting. But the insult isn't mine. It's the mirror you're looking into." The studio was completely still. Then Colbert, with a voice thinner than usual, tried to interject. "All right, maybe we dial this back a bit." Denzel cut in gently. Not loudly, not forcefully, just with the weight of someone who had nothing to prove and everything to protect. "No, Stephen asked for this. Or at least the people who booked him did. You brought me here to talk about civic duty. I'm doing that. You brought him here to talk about loyalty. He's avoiding that." Stephen opened his mouth to speak, but was met with Denzel raising his hand. "I'm not done." He turned back toward the audience, not performing, just bringing them into the space he now fully owned. Denzel said, "You know what patriotism looks like? It's not waving a flag while telling half the country they don't belong. It's not smirking at poverty, mocking protesters, or twisting faith to justify cruelty. It's feeding someone who's hungry, housing someone who's homeless, and respecting someone who serves, even when they don't look like you." He paused, not for drama, just to let the truth settle. It's knowing your country is flawed and loving it enough to fight for its better self. Every day, even when no one's watching. The audience erupted into applause. Not polite, not studio scripted, but honest. Loud, grateful. Stephen tried again. "I believe in borders. I believe in law and order. If that offends you." Denzel interrupted. "What offends me is pretending cruelty is policy. What offends me is ignoring the law when it serves your interests and then weaponizing it when others ask for equality. You don't believe in order. You believe in control. And that's not patriotism. That's cowardice wrapped in a flag." Colbert raised his hands in surrender. "Gentlemen." But even he wasn't trying to stop it anymore. He just looked stunned. Then Stephen, desperate to shift the tone, said, "You're making this personal." Denzel looked directly at him. "It is personal. Because America is personal. For the people who build it, who bleed for it, who carry it even when it won't carry them. You don't get to come here and sanitize what you helped break. Not while I'm sitting here. Now, before we continue, and what happens next will stun you, I need to tell you something. These moments don't air in full. They're edited, softened, rewritten for comfort. But if you want to see the full story, The version they won't show on TV? Then subscribe right now. Don't wait. Be one of the few who still chooses truth over polish. What Denzel says next will make the studio question everything. Steven said quietly, "I've served this country in my way." Denzel didn't yell. He just looked at him for a long moment. Then said, clearly, "You served yourself. That's not the same thing." Then he stood. It wasn't planned. It wasn't dramatic. It was just necessary. Denzel said, "I didn't come here to argue with ghosts. I came to remind people what real love of country looks like. And I've said what I needed to say." Steven asked, "So you're leaving?" Denzel looked at him one last time. "No, I'm done giving men like you the luxury of my silence." And then he sat back down, but everything had changed. Not the show, the ground beneath it. The air inside the Colbert studio had changed. You could feel it in the audience's posture. People leaned forward, not for entertainment, but because something real was happening, something rare. The show was still technically a comedy, but no one was laughing now. Denzel Washington sat still, composed, almost serene. His voice hadn't risen. He hadn't insulted anyone. But the room was undeniably his. Stephen Miller tried to recover with policy talk. He leaned in toward Colbert and said, "What we're witnessing now is the problem with discourse. Emotionalism replaces reason. Sentiment replaces structure." Denzel turned slowly, meeting him with calm intensity. He said, "You don't get to hide behind big words now. You came here to sell a version of America that excludes people like me. But I've lived in this country longer than your ideology has existed, and I'll still be here when it's gone." Colbert, clearly uneasy, tried to bring the moment back to neutral ground. He said, "Let's take a breath. Maybe we talk about how patriotism shows up in small ways, volunteering, community work, that sort of thing." Denzel looked at him gently. "That's the conversation we could have had. But that's not what this was set up to be." He turned back to Stephen. "This was bait, and I bit it. Because I'm tired of pretending these setups are accidents. They're not. You bring people like me to balance the table, then seat us next to people who helped build cages." The audience murmured. Stephen raised his hands defensively. "That's not what happened." "You're right," Denzel said. "It's worse. You didn't build the cages. You normalized them. You used language to make cruelty sound necessary. And that might be the most dangerous thing of all." Colbert tried again. "Let's move on to another topic." Denzel interrupted, but not harshly. "Stephen, I want to ask you something." Stephen nodded, wary. "Go ahead. When you go home at night, do you feel proud? Not powerful, not successful. I'm asking if you feel proud of what you've contributed to this country." Stephen hesitated. "I believe I've protected its values." Denzel said, "Whose values?" "Not mine. Not the single mother working 2 jobs to keep her kid in school. Not the immigrant who believes in this country more than the people born here. Not the veteran who came home broken and got ignored. Whose values are you protecting?" Stephen tried to respond, but his voice faltered. Denzel didn't press. He just let the silence hang. "Now, before what happens next, and it gets even more intense, I need to ask you something. If you believe moments like this matter, that truth should be heard in full and not trimmed for comfort, then subscribe now. Before this gets edited, before it disappears, before they reshape it into something safer. Subscribe and stand for unfiltered moments that say what most shows won't dare. Because what happens next changes everything." Colbert shifted uncomfortably. "We're going to take a break." But the audience wasn't done. A woman in the third row stood up. Not planned. Not a plant. Just someone who had heard enough. She said, "Thank you, Denzel." The audience clapped. Softly at first, then stronger. Stephen looked stunned. Denzel just nodded. Not at the woman, but to the moment. As if to say, that's all I came for. When the show returned from break, the energy was different. Stephen was quieter. Colbert looked tired. Denzel sat like a stone, calm but immovable. They tried to shift topics, climate change, education, infrastructure. But the panel had already been redefined. Because no matter what they talked about next, The truth had already been spoken, and it couldn't be undone. The final segment of the Colbert Show was supposed to be light. A trivia game, a scripted laugh, something to soften the tension and remind viewers that this was still entertainment. But the tension had not lifted, and no one was in the mood to play along. Stephen Miller sat with his arms folded, eyes scanning the crowd as if trying to find someone who still believed he had control of the room. But the audience had shifted. It wasn't about politics anymore. It was about clarity, and the moment for pretending had passed. Denzel Washington hadn't said a word since the return from the break. He didn't need to. His silence spoke louder than any punchline could. His presence alone was a kind of truth that couldn't be filtered. Colbert tried to shift the mood with a pre-written joke. It landed flat. No laughter, no smiles, just polite attention that felt more like tolerance than engagement. Finally, Denzel spoke again, slowly, without performance. I didn't come here to cause a scene. I came here to tell the truth, because I'm tired of watching people confuse silence with peace. Stephen looked over. So now I'm the enemy? Denzel shook his head. No, the enemy is the lie you keep telling yourself, that this country belongs to the people who yell the loudest. That power justifies cruelty. That patriotism is measured by how many people you can exclude. Stephen didn't respond. Denzel continued. Real patriotism doesn't walk out when the conversation gets hard. It leans in. It listens. It admits when it's wrong. And it never, ever, uses the flag to silence someone else's pain. A beat of silence followed. Then Colbert said, That's probably a good place to end. But it wasn't the end. As the credits began to roll, something unusual happened. A crew member, a camera operator, stood up in the wings. Then another, and another. Denzel turned slightly to look, and they all nodded. Quietly, respectfully. Stephen sat frozen. Colbert looked out at the audience, unsure of what had just happened. The energy was no longer his. It belonged to the moment. And then Denzel stood. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't wave. He just turned to Stephen one last time and said, I served. You sold out. And deep down, you know it. Then he walked off stage. Not with drama, with dignity. And as the door closed behind him, the audience stood. Not for Stephen. Not for Colbert. For the man who told the truth and walked out taller than he came in. Later that night, the segment aired, but it was edited. The harshest lines were cut. The crowd reactions trimmed. The moment softened. But it didn't matter, because someone in the studio had kept a raw feed. And before sunrise, the uncut footage was everywhere. The full exchange. The full silence. The full truth. Hashtag Denzel was right began trending by morning. Veterans, teachers, nurses, students, people from every walk of life shared the clip, not as a gotcha, but as a mirror. Someone finally said what needed saying, and said it with the kind of quiet fury that no edit could erase. Stephen Miller didn't respond publicly, but in every future interview, the question came up, do you regret the Colbert appearance? And every time, he tried to pivot, but the footage always found its way back. Because the truth, once spoken clearly enough, doesn't disappear. It echoes. It doesn't need to shout. It just needs to be said once in full. And Denzel Washington said it.